Now seriously, how many times have I told you to like and subscribe to the goddamn Miniature Dork universe? And what, you thought you could just take all the tips and tricks for yourself? Take that!
Something doesn't seem right here. I wonder...
What did I tell you about not liking and subscribing to the fucking Miniature Dork universe there, Metallic? I bet you thought you were really fucking cute, but you ain't so cute now. And look at those stupid pants. There's a couple more douchebags that didn't like and subscribe to the goddamn Miniature Dork universe. Just wait till I get my mitts on them. Boy, they'll be sorry now.
Hello and welcome back. We'll get right into it. I was putting together some terrain for a game that I want to play, and some of my other jungle terrain videos did well, so I thought I might as well include how I made these for this game. So I did the bunker and this banana grove. The setting is going to be for the Dutch East Indies, so I did a bit of looking online. The banana grove edges are kind of sharp, but I'll likely, when I play the game, just use clump foliage to sort of make the edges a little more random. I'm going to play another one of these Crossfire mini scenarios that I did a whole video on. And so in the lower right hand corner you see a map icon, which is actually an orchard. So in place of that I've decided to do a banana grove. So I've looked up online and got pictures of actual Indonesian banana groves, and I did mine in a way that it's kind of similar, but the aisles in between the trees are a bit wider to accommodate stands of infantry. The mini scenarios scale out all of the terrain features for you. So in the case of the orchard or my banana grove, we're dealing with 6 by 6 inches. And the other terrain feature I worked on to complete this map was number 2, which is a bunker up there by the crossroads. In the map it's square, but I did the token round one, which is what the KNIL seemed to use in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. This is a picture from Osprey Publications' book on the Dutch East Indies campaign, and here's the Japanese charging an oil field, I think maybe Tarakan. And you can see in the background the pillboxes with the machine gun flashes firing upon them. And here's an actual picture. I think this might have been one of their defensive lines on Java, and they've let the vegetation overgrow it. And that was part of the issue with a lot of their defensive areas, that was still too overgrown, so they didn't have clear fields of fire. And here's another example of a surviving bunker in nowadays Indonesia. It has some kind of weird octagon thing on top. I had considered doing the shields by the door, but I just wanted to get it done, so I kind of bailed on that. And also you could use the same shape of bunker for the Japanese. They used similar bunkers. Here's an example of a Japanese one on a Pacific island somewhere. So yeah, the model is by Gaming Models, if you're interested in getting that, and it's in resin. Alright, here we go. Let's start with the banana groves. So these are trees from Pegasus Miniatures. Here's the box up here. And they might be a little bit bulky for 15 mil, but they're not bad, right? It doesn't look ridiculous. Definitely the the bamboo that I made is out of scale, probably for many scales, but I would say these banana trees are probably perfect though for 20 millimeter. But I have no issues using them for 15 mil. So yeah, we put them down on these popsicle sticks so that we can paint them, and I stuck them on with some sticky tack. But before doing that, I trimmed off any excess flash and I washed them in some water with a bit of detergent. Then I got my base ready. So this is 2 millimeter plywood, and I've skived the edges down. I used a knife and sanded it a bit just to skive it and blend it into the surrounding a little bit better. And then I primed both sides. So plywood is good because it's going to help you against warping, and also priming both sides is good because that's going to help you against warping as well. Because the paint will dry and start to warp one side, and then when you do the other side, it counteracts that. So the thing stayed very straight throughout the construction process. So that's kind of cool. And I managed to buy 6x6 pieces of plywood in 2mm right off of AliExpress for like $4 or something. And then I mixed up a 3-to-1 mix of Tamiya deep green and flat yellow. And then it's time to get crazy with the airbrush and just go around and zap everything. I'm using this as a bit of a primer too. And once it's dry, I'm going to add yellow into what's remaining in my paint cup and a bit of thinner, and we'll do the highlight. Then I'm just going to come straight down on the top of the banana leaves and leave some of the original paint to make a sort of natural shadow. In hindsight, I wish I had gone even lighter, maybe even added a bit more yellow, because I ended up using a shade paint, which is my first time using those contrast paints. And it worked really well, but you know, having this been my first experiment, I just wish I had gone a bit lighter. Then I mixed up a very pale yellow green. So here's some just flat yellow. Sure, it doesn't matter what paint you use. And for the blue, I used AK Imperial Blue, just because it's what I had. But again, I think you could use any yellow and blue. You're just going for a very, you know, very pale sort of, or bright, you know, yellow-green color. And I'm going to do this to dry brush the leaves to get more of the texture of the banana leaves to show out. See, it's almost yellow. So yeah, I add a little bit more. Still want it green, but again, in hindsight, I probably could have gone, or should have gone, with just the straight up yellow, because the shade paint darkened it up a bit. I was happy with the outcome, but yeah, it could have been lighter for sure. And then we go a little bit dry brush crazy. Again, using those contrast paints later, the dry brush doesn't have to be like a super awesome dry brush. Just not like super crazy chalky. I use a big brush like this. I find it gives you sort of a better coverage. And some of the shaded areas I'm not going to bother dry brushing. The contrast paint is still going to add like depth to the areas that haven't been dry brushed. Obviously it goes into all of the shallow areas and darkens them up a bit, but it also tints the whole thing. And so that's why I'm saying I should have gone a bit lighter. So then we get in with our Citadel colors, which take nerdiness to whole new levels that, you know, even surpass the Miniature Dork universe, because they have names like Lamian, Medium, and Carandras Green. But that's what I use. The medium, it's a better thing than using water to thin out the paint, so it's not quite so opaque. I mean, it's not opaque, period, but you know what I'm saying. If you want to thin it out, use the medium, because otherwise you might get that frosty stuff that you've seen in some of my previous videos. You can just fix it with a bit of gloss paint, but then you have to go in later and hit it with some matte. So here's what it looks like done. I'll paint a little here, but the one that's dry brushed the most, you can see the most detail. The one in the middle hasn't been hit with the contrast paint yet, so you can see how the paint tones the whole thing overall. I applied the contrast paint only to the top side of the leaves here. You can't even see the bottom, so you know, it's kind of a waste of time to do it. I mean, you could, but honestly, unless you're holding the whole thing upside down, you'll never see the bottom of the leaves. So I go around and paint these, and it was very satisfying. As you can see, these shade paints are pretty cool. I think using them for terrain is a great application for them too. I think I'm still a bit too chicken shit to use them for figures, but yeah, they work out really well for things like this. And I imagine if you're doing like stone walls and things like that, it could be pretty wicked. The only thing about these shade paints is that they dry kind of glossy, like sort of like a satin finish. So in the case of these leaves, I just left it because the actual leaves are kind of shiny. But yeah, if you're doing things like buildings and what have you, you'll need to hit it with a matte coat. Now that the trees are all done with the shade painting, I'm going to paint the stems, and for that I'm going to use burnt umber, with which I'm going to make a wash. English uniform is going to be one of the base colors, and German camouflage beige, and then I'll give it a dry brush with stone gray. I forgot to mention first I used this Deco Art burnt sienna for the base. I'm going to start with English uniform. Now the banana tree stems are very papery and it kind of peels off in chunks. So I'm doing a very patchy coat with the English uniform. Then I went on to the German camouflage beige, World War II. And again, I'm just painting on strips and patches to sort of imitate that look of the dried out peeling bark. The stem that the bananas are attached to, I painted that in the German camouflage beige as well. Then I made a wash with burnt umber. I put a dot of that shit in my paint palette, and then I got some flow improver that's watered down with water. You've seen me use this before if you've watched my videos, and then zap it in there, and you can see how the surface tension breaks and how that likes to flow. After which I apply the wash to my trees here, and that'll bring out some of the deeper recesses and shading. And I'm not being too careful. I'm staying away from the leaves though. I'm just going to be putting the wash on the stems. Then the final bit of the stem painting will be this stone gray, and for this I'm going to dry brush it and just pick up a bunch of the highlights and really add to that sort of papery, peely bark look that we're going for. Using a rag, just get most of the paint off the brush, and you can use the rag to test out how much paint you've got before you commit to laying it down on your stem. And then we grab this and just away you go. It's going to be more paint on it at the beginning, so I'm going kind of in vertical direction so that we don't get really blotchy looking stuff. And then as the paint starts to leave the brush, you can get a bit more aggressive with it. And I'm not being super careful here. Again, we're just going for a very patchy coat, but we're also trying to bring out some of the details in the trunk. Now the trees are painted, and we'll move on to preparing the base. So to start with, I've put a line down the center. The center line of trees will follow this pencil line, and I'm going to make sort of the dirt in between. And that's going to be simply done by painting on some Mod Podge, and then I'm going to use regular beach sand just to add some texture, and then I'll paint it kind of a reddish color. I'm going to paint on that Mod Podge with a big wide brush, and I'm leaving some rough lanes for the trees to glue in later. I'm going to use actual groundwork around the trees, but for this space in between, we're just going to go full Mod Podge. And then I grab my handy scoop in the beach sand and just sprinkle it on like so. I highly recommend one of these types of scoops for all kinds of terrain stuff like this. I've got a metal cookie sheet underneath too to catch all this stuff, and then whatever doesn't end up on my base ends up back in the jar. After I let it dry, I go back to my flow improver, and to seal down any loose bits that remain, I'll spray the whole thing with the flow improver with a little sprayer, just like so. And then with an eyedropper, I'm dropping on some of the watered down Mod Podge. Some of it doesn't look so watered down there, but you know what I mean. It should look like the watery stuff that looks a bit like skim milk. And when it's dry, it should look something like this. And then I'll get my burnt sienna, and I'm going to paint the entire base with the burnt sienna. So I'm going for this sort of reddish color soil. That's sort of the plowed up soil common in Southeast Asia. And then for the jungle, I'm using the kind of gray brown. After that's dry, I give it a dry brush with the Deco Art Terracotta. Sorry, I didn't show you the actual paint here. Sort of forgot to do that, but I bet you could imagine what a bottle of terracotta paint looks like, and here I am dry brushing it. When that's dry, I do a highlight with this golden brown just by dry brushing it pretty haphazardly. I was a bit overzealous there, but later on it's not going to matter. I use these craft paints for groundwork. After that, it's time to stick the trees to the base, and I'm going to use 2-part epoxy like this because I feel like it's a little less brittle than super glue, and I feel like it's not going to soak into the wood as much when I add it to the trees. Now you can get this stuff that dries in different time increments. I got the 5-minute stuff, so I had to work really fast. Not this fast, I sped it up a bit. But, maybe 10-minute would probably be more reasonable. So I mix them up. I stick it to the base. I've left a lane for these trees in the middle. And then I just start to place them. And it goes pretty smooth. But yeah, I'm working pretty fast here, and see I had a little bit of a balls up there. I bet you I said some pretty bad words too. But look, there it is. All done and ready for the next row. Now I mix up the actual groundwork that I'm going to place around the trees with the burnt sienna. And I'll leave a link to how I make that groundwork. I have a whole video on it, and I'll put that in the description below. Once all my epoxy is dry, which wasn't very long, then I started to lay down the groundwork using a sculpting tool and just carefully place it. I'm making sort of a row. It's a bit of a raised row where the trees are. But I'm blending it in pretty good. And then you should end up with something like this. When the stuff was still wet, I went along the edges with a really wet brush and really blended that groundwork in with the other stuff. And then I break out these 2 chaps again and dry brush around the trees. And here we go doing the shit. Getting it all done. And yeah, I guess we all know what dry brushing some stuff on the ground looks like. At this point, I use some Mod Podge to stick down some fine turf. And I mixed a couple of colors of fine turf together to get this, like a sort of dead, shitty looking turf with some brighter green, deeper green color. And I'm trying to be pretty random here. And then I get my super wicked scoop and pour it on. And of course I have my cookie sheet here to pick up all the stuff that falls off. One of the main features of these banana groves is all the dead leaves and dead bark that has fallen to the ground and turned brown. So to make that, I'm using coffee filter, and I simply snip a bunch of little strips of it. I crumpled it up, and I'll just keep snipping away. I add ivory paint to a section of it to cut out some more pieces that are a slightly different color, just to add more richness to the amount of colors that are coming through without actually having to go through and painstakingly paint all these little pieces in. I'm going to do the same with some pebble, and that little patch there is about the size of patches that I'm cutting out. So I'll have an equal part patch of the ivory, the pebble, and just the straight up color, and that's enough to do the whole board. And you should end up with something that looks like this. Looks pretty good. I'm also going to add in some of this dried leaf scatter, just again to add some more color variety and some more shape variety too, just to make it look nice and rich. I glue it down with Mod Podge. I'm going to make random little blotches and put it on quite heavy so that you have a lot of glue to adhere these things. And then I sprinkle it on the best that I can. It gets a little tricky because these trees are really low to the ground. And so it's a bit of a dick, but only a bit of a dick. And you can get most of it on, as you see. And I use tweezers and things also to position them around if I needed spots to fill in. And with this glass eyedropper, I'm going to get more of the watered down Mod Podge. And I'll use that on top while it's all still wet. And then when it dries, it's stuck down pretty good. Yeah, I do it while the stuff underneath is still wet because it causes like a capillary action too, where it really soaks through. And the coffee filter is designed to be soaked, so that's a good medium to use as well. And when it's done, it should look a bit like this. I've glued some random pieces down, and I just used the eyedropper to glue that stuff down. You can see parts where it's sort of spread out, but that dried very clear. Then in any bare spots, I add a bit of different shades of green clump foliage, just randomly. And I added some of these grass tufts with leaves randomly as well. And I also stuck those on with Mod Podge. I used tweezers and a dental pick to make sure that it goes into place, and as it dries I keep pushing it down just to make sure it gets a nice tight seal. And at the end of the day you should end up with something that looks quite a bit like this. And I was pretty happy with it. I really like the dead leaf stuff, and I think if you're doing anything jungle or forest, if you just put lots of dead shit on the ground, it's going to look great and it's going to look realistic. So you can achieve that through many means by using actual dead leaves. I've ground them up in coffee grinders before, but these had a specific shape to them, so I ended up just cutting it with coffee filter. But it was cheap, it was a bit time consuming, but the end result speaks for itself. Now we have a bit of a double header today. Let's move on to our KNIL bunker. We're going to be picking this one up in progress because I started to build it before I thought I would throw it in with this video, but then I thought, why not? So what you're seeing here is it's on a piece of ceramic tile, and I didn't have a big enough one to do the whole thing at once, but what I'm doing is, this is cork, and I've put primer on both sides like I did with the base of the banana grove. And now I'm placing the groundwork over the cork, and I'm using the tile so that I can bring the groundwork right down to the tile and then later break it away. And that way it's not going to curl up and it's not going to warp. The walkway that I put on was just made with some dollar store veneers that I broke up into little planks and sort of haphazardly put them down. And then I put my groundwork on the roof in this case. So a lot of the examples I showed were just straight up pillboxes, but in this one I have it where they've put soil on the roof and let the vegetation grow in. There was no stopper on the roof, so it was just on there loose, and it was kind of a dick. So I just made a sort of like cork stopper out of craft foam and painted it the same color as I painted the rest of the bunker. I used orange craft foam. I should have used gray because, yeah, orange shows through, but this prevents it from sliding around. So you have to sort of register it first, get it lined up as best as you can. I just used pencil marks before it was painted so that I could see where the alignment was. And with the registration marks marked on the lid, I put some masking tape on it, turned it upside down, and then traced the inner wall onto the top of the lid where it was in register, so that when I trace out my stopper that I'm going to make with the foam, it'll all be in register, and it worked out beautifully. I just traced the inner edge of the wall onto the top of the roof, something like this, although I had tape and registration marks on mine. Then I trace out the inner wall on some of this 2mm craft foam. I think you'll see where I'm going with this, so that once it's done, when I glue it onto the roof, it'll register perfectly. So just make sure you do the right, that you're tracing out the top, because if you trace out the bottom by accident, it's not going to be good. After I cut out the foam, cut it to size to my tracing there, and then I use this heavy duty contact cement to cement the foam onto the resin roof. I also used some registration marks before I glued it, so I knew exactly where to position it when the glue was on it. Because the roof wasn't entirely round, I put some battle damage in it with one of these engraver pens, which is a great tool to have. I used it, to make the battle damage so that, after the thing is done, I can use that as a visual aid to get the alignment right, so I'm not crushing up the little stopper that I'm building on the interior of the roof. So back to the part I was at when I started this and decided to make it into a video. I'm going to just carefully chop away the groundwork from the tile. I'm being careful so that it doesn't roll up, but at some point it should just pop off. And you'll get a nice clean edge. And as the groundwork dries, it kind of sticks to that tile, and it prevents anything from curling up or warping. So it's kind of great. The only reason why this tile is the size it is because it's the only piece of ceramic tile I had. And this is what the bottom looks like. So you can see that's nice and sharp. And then with the tile, you can just scrape off the excess with a blade, and it's kind of satisfying. Then I continued to cover the areas that weren't covered yet, so I put that area over the tile, and I just start working my groundwork in. This is sort of a painter's palette knife, I think, and it does a good job for these larger areas. And it should look something like this when it's all done. So make sure you get the very edge nice and sharp and well attached down to the tile. When it's all done, I'm going to use this acrylic gel. It's a bit tougher than just straight up Mod Podge, although you could use straight up Mod Podge if that's what you have. But I'm just going to run that around the edges just to solidify them and strengthen them a bit so they don't chip off. So I'm going to mix it in with a bit of water till it gets to a consistency about like this. And then I'm going to go around the edges. And that'll just, it dries pretty plasticky, like a good acrylic product should. And it works very well. And I'm going to do the same on the bottom. Because the bulk of my groundwork is celluclay, which is a paper mache, so it can get kind of flaky. Once that's dry, I painted up the wooden things using some oil washes that I had made earlier. So I started off with this burnt umber. I'm adding a bit of odorless thinner, and I just put it on like a stain. And as you can see, it's pretty good. You get all the wood texture in there, and it's looking pretty nice. And once I get that done, I got into some green that I made, and then I'm going to put some kind of mossy-like stuff in. Just work it around until you get it to the point where it looks good. The whole bunker was painted inside and out, and including the floor with this cobblestone color paint. The battle damage, which would have been fresher concrete that's not weathered, I painted in with the suede color. And you know, these colors, there's a lot of colors you can use. Just think of concrete stuff like sort of grayish, brownish, you know, tan, whatever, white. The groundwork was done with this charcoal gray. This is my sort of go-to jungle color, and I mixed it right into the actual groundwork. But then any areas that need little touch-ups or something, I just use it straight out of the bottle. And now I'm going to dry brush all the earth areas with pebble. And if some of it gets onto the concrete stuff, that's not the end of the deal. So I'm going to use a big brush for this and just lightly go over the whole thing. A wash was put on all the concrete areas, so I used that Ammo dark wash. And I watered it down quite a bit because it is quite dark. I also sprayed flow improver all over everything. You can see the floor here. It's basically straight up cork, and there's some Mr. Surfacer on it to blend it in with the walls. So having sprayed all of this with my flow improver, I'm going to go around in a very streaky way and just put some of that Ammo dark wash over the entire thing. And just keep going and keep working it until you get it to a level that you want. When it was all done, it turned out really subtle. I think when I put a lot of the vegetation on, a lot of the washing and things that I did seemed to disappear a lot. A lot of the streaks and stuff. I don't know why, but it just did. So if you want to go heavier, then just keep working around the thing until it's to the level where you're happy. Once all that was done, I decided to do a little bit of artistic license and put a Dutch flag on the wall. I'm not sure how likely that would have been because a lot of the KNIL was comprised of like Indonesian troops, and at the time there was a lot of separatist feeling. I don't think they particularly loved their Dutch colonists, and so that might have just been antagonizing to someone who might have been already thinking, do I actually want to fight the Japanese? Although I'm thinking by then news would have traveled from China about what the Japanese were all about. So these guys probably were pretty motivated to keep them out of the Dutch East Indies. And there were a lot of cases where they did fight pretty hard. And I think the issue with the KNIL is just that they were poorly equipped and poorly trained for that kind of warfare. They were basically trained to put down, separatist uprisings. That was their main role. That being said, a lot of their equipment was on par with what the Japanese were using. They just didn't have the abundance of it. So I just put this on as a regular sort of decal. I didn't use any gloss coat under it that I normally do, but I put on a lot of the decal fixative, and that worked really well. It really snuggled up into the texture of the concrete. Once all the decals and washes were dry, I went around and gave it a dry brush with the cobblestone color, and I did it in a very vertical way, so it had a sort of streaky look. And yeah, that's a good way to do it. Then I did the same with some antique white around the entire bunker. And just like with the pebble, I do vertical strokes with the dry brush all the way around, and just keep going until you get enough of the streakiness and the light highlights that you want. This next part, I was a total dick and forgot to put the record button on my camera. So I used watered down yellow olive to make like moss and algae, and then watered down yellow green. I also put paint, like acrylic retardant, in the paint, so it took longer to dry, and it's nice to blend it together that way. So you put it on quite wet, it's quite thin, and you can just blend the two colors together until you get it what you want. And I also added some more of the brown streaks with the ammo wash. I broke out some of these Pan's Pastels. It's like a red-brown color, and I'm going to use that just to put some dirt on the inside of the bunker where guys are coming in with their boots. The color is more like the color I use for my banana groves, but it's sort of like the earth of the plowed up stuff. The surface stuff seems to be like the gray jungly color, but like the fields and things are sort of this red stuff, which is, I'm thinking, the red stuff that's underneath. And I think the two colors will kind of complement each other well, and it'll add a bit of interest to it. We also have this red soil where I live in the Annapolis Valley. However, ours is ocean sediment with iron in it. And the jungle stuff, I think somehow the rotting vegetation brings the iron out in it. But nevertheless, it's red. But then you also have pockets of other colors of earth around. So it's a nice way just to add color to your layouts. I didn't bother using any kind of fixative for this either, because it's just in the corners and it's inside, and even the base of the figures isn't going to really touch it. So I don't imagine that it's going to get messed up. At this point, it was time to add some of the vegetation to the groundwork. So I'm going to use Mod Podge and some fine turf. And we'll start by putting random spots on the roof. And keep working those around and put on some of your fine turf. Knock it off and it's ready to go. And that's how it should look, just kind of random. Very patchy. And I put some of the fine turf on the inside. I used a fine brush and made it look kind of like moss. And it really complements the green washes that I put in that look like algae, which is common with cement structures in a wet jungle. Now it's time to break out my horrendous AliExpress static grass applicator. I call it Chairman Mao's Revenge because it electrocutes me all the time. But you know what? It does the trick, and it cost me 40 bucks. The sock is just there to prevent that glare from getting in your eyes and blinding you. I fire on some Mod Podge blotches, very similar to what I used for the fine turf. I put a bit more glue on though, like I make heavier blobs just so that it sticks the grass on a little better. Just work my way around. Once that's done, grab the static grass applicator and start applying the static grass, surprisingly enough. And yeah, be careful not to touch the metal mesh. The problem I have with it is even after you turn this off switch off, it maintains a charge. And the odd time I forget, and then I touch it, and it makes a loud crack, and I say a lot of bad words, and my wife looks at me like I'm crazy, which I partially am, as you well know. Once the static grass was done, I chucked some jungle plants in, and they look just like the ones in the picture, kind of. And I painted these the same time as I did my banana leaves, so they're done exactly with the same airbrush, and then I used the contrast paint just on the top. Adding more volume to the vegetation, I'm going to use a couple different grass tufts. And I cut them into sections, like into smaller pieces with some sharp scissors. And I kept the sizes kind of random so they weren't all the exact same size, because these tufts look very uniform. I wanted to break that up a little bit. And I'm going to stick these on with tacky glue because it's a little bit stickier. Slap some tacky on your tuft. Come on, tacky, where are you? There you go. Fire that up. I'm using tweezers to hold the tuft and place it where you like to go, roughly. You know, in a bare spot. I'm adding all of this stuff to bare areas. If it overlaps a bit, it's not such a big deal. And then I'll use this sculpting tool to sort of hold it in place, and we'll push it down so that it gets a good surface area covered with the glue. And we don't want ends of the tufts sticking up either, because that looks kind of wanky. You want to push them down so that it looks realistic. Then I fired on chunks of the other tufts with the leafy bits, and we're getting closer to our finale. And here it is, all grass tufted up. I also added some clump foliage here and there, just in areas where it seemed kind of bare, and just added a little bit more volume. There's some of the glue that's still wet, but it dries really clear, that tacky glue as well, so you don't have to really worry about that. And we're well on our way to a success story, and I really like how those plants turned out. I stuck some guitar string into the plants to pin them down. I used, fine gauge guitar string and just pegged the actual plant, and then pegged it into the cork that the base is made out of, and it sticks on quite nicely. The final act of this show was to get some pastel chalks, like the colored kind, and I scrape it with a blade and essentially make like a pigment powder, really. You can use it interchangeably, and I put some white in there to lighten it up. And what I want to do is where the impacts are on the front of the bunker, I want to make it look like that concrete has been blasted into powder and sort of just rested or landed on the vegetation in front of it, just to add, just to kind of tie it in, and that kind of stuff I think is sort of cool. So I'll mix it around. You don't even have to mix it too much, because it's good if the different colors sort of show through as well. So get it to where you like, and then I'm going to take the actual bunker, and I'm just going to flick that shit right under where the impacts were. I'll use, Whoop, some of that must still be wet. Oops. And I'm just going to add that to that entire area. And just keep putting it in until you're satisfied with it. And again, with this, I didn't bother using any kind of fixative because it's never going to get touched. You know, the space for the machine gun inside is the only place where there's going to be a figure. I'm not going to be putting any of the infantry stands on the bunker. They don't really need to go on the bunker. If there's like a close assault, as long as it's in contact with the bunker, you know that it's going to be a close combat or something. So if I get my meaty old mitt out of the way, you'll see a bit better. That one looks pretty good. So I just carefully added that until I was satisfied with it, and then the bunker was done. And here's what it looked like when it's all finished. So the roof stays on quite nicely because the foam is sort of spongy, so it kind of corks the lid on pretty nicely. And I did the interior with the flag. There's also a 40s pinup girl on the wall over there. I'm not sure if that would have been done, but I've seen them in vehicles and things, in actual pictures, so why not stick it in a bunker? Maybe you need somewhere to escape with your thoughts when you're being attacked by crazed, bloodlusting Japanese that you're not going to be able to defeat. Anyway, I was pretty happy with how that turned out. I added a bit of lighter paint into the impact wounds, or impact marks on the walls. Impact wounds, what am I talking about? I used some white just to make it lighter inside those, the damage from the gunfire. While I was working on the bananas and the bunkers, I made these markers. I printed them out on the computer, stuck them to adhesive magnet, and then used a hole punch like this. You use a hammer and just give it a good whack, and it'll knock it out. And I have a punch the size for these smaller ones. So the small ones are hidden markers. So you place this under a terrain feature that the unit is in, and it shows you what unit it is. So like on the left here, 1, 2, and 3 squad, and you just tuck that in a building or under something, and then that's where your hidden marker is. The bigger initiative markers I use for Crossfire, I do my initiatives a little bit different. If you want to see how I do that, you can watch some of my previous Crossfire videos. Here's what they look like when they're all punched out. I use a green marker, the white edges, I just color them in green with this. And they're magnetized, and all my infantry stands are magnetized, so I can store it all in metal boxes and they're not flying everywhere. And so it's a quick, easy way to get a fairly attractive looking marker. And that's about all I have to say about that. You just have to be careful with the punch to make sure you have them registered nicely. I also did this road sign while I was doing everything else in this little bundle of stuff. That was done on the computer. I have a whole video on making road signs, so I'll put a link to that in the description below too. So we got Kalajati and Surabaya. Those are the two main airports on Java when the Japanese attacked. As well, I did these Japanese Type 97 tanks from Peter Pig. So I got pretty busy here. Maybe that's why it took so long to get a video out. If you're interested in how I did the painting, I have a video on painting Japanese tanks as well. So I will put that also in the description if you're doing some Pacific stuff. These I put green stuff inside. They're metal kits, and I filled them with green stuff and then used a dowel that was wet to punch out the green stuff and make a space for the turret ring, and I magnetized it. and it turned out pretty wicked. That's going to do it for this round of Miniature Dork Universe. So as always, thanks for watching, and here's hoping some of the tips and tricks in this crazy video helped you, and that you're moving through your own jungle hobby geek time with great enthusiasm. I don't know what I'm saying. I got nothing. Just stay tuned, because of course Miniature Dork Universe is coming back. Bye for now.